Welcome back to K-12 Analytics. I am Marco Selkoser, and today we are going to talk about how to right-size your EdFi admin app, API, and ODS so that you consume the least amount of resources in Google Cloud, which means you pay the least amount of money, but you're also set up to have the right size resources to accept the traffic that is going into your EdFi ODS. Now, with a product like Google Cloud Run, that's a managed serverless offering. What that means is that when the EdFi API and the admin app are not being utilized, Google Cloud is going to spin down to zero, and it's going to consume no resources, and it's not going to charge you, which is awesome. As data starts to come in through your API, so your SIS, your assessment vendors, your other vendors, they start to interact with that EdFi API to push in data and update it. Well, Google Cloud Run is going to start to add container instances to your EdFi API service in order to scale to handle that traffic. Now, there are a few things to tweak with Google Cloud Run, and I'm going to go over 4 of the big ones. Now, the first pertains to the actual container instance, and that's how many vCPUs are actually allocated to each container instance. The second is how much memory to actually allocate to each container instance. The third is the maximum number of requests that each container is going to be able to handle at one time. The fourth is the maximum number of container instances that your Google Cloud Run service can scale up to. A Cloud Run service is scaled up to the number of container instances that are needed to handle all incoming requests. And so Cloud Run tries to keep the CPU utilization to 60% or lower. And so that metric, combined with your maximum number of concurrent connections to a container instance and the maximum number of container instances that you're allowing in the service, is all used together to decide whether Google Cloud Run should add another container instance, take one away, and that's really deciding how it's going to auto-scale. Cloud SQL does not auto-scale in the same way as Cloud Run. Cloud SQL decides the maximum number of connections that can be made at one time by using the amount of memory that's allocated to the Cloud SQL instance. So this chart here will show you that depending on the amount of memory that you've allocated to your instance, well, that defines the maximum number of connections that can be made. Now, there is an exception to this, and that is that Cloud SQL has flags, and one of those flags allows you to override that number. And so Cloud SQL is pretty conservative with the number of connections that can be made to a Cloud SQL instance. And so I often use flags to bump up the default number just a little bit. A handy little tip too is you can actually run SQL on your Cloud SQL instance to see what this maximum number of connections is currently set to. If you've watched videos on this channel before, then you know that I've done a video on how to deploy EdFi in Google Cloud. That code is using my recommendation for a base Google Cloud Run configuration and Cloud SQL for EdFi. I suggest that you start there. And so I suggest that you start there and you connect your SIS and your assessment platforms to your EdFi ODS and you have them start sending data. Once they've been sending data for a little bit, maybe 7 days, you can actually go into Cloud Run and Cloud SQL and you can see how they're performing. One of the things you can see is you can see how many container instances Cloud Run is using for your EdFi API. And you can start to use this information to decide how you want to tweak your settings. Let's look at a diagram to start to picture how all of this works. So here on the left side, we have our EdTech vendors that are sending data to our ODS through the API. And we have our EdFi API implemented via Cloud Run. So we have a Cloud Run service that has a minimum number of containers of 0, so it can auto-scale and doesn't charge us for anything, as a maximum of only 3. Okay, so each container instance is set to allow a maximum number of connections of 80, to have virtual CPUs of 2, and memory set to 2 gigs per container instance. So that means that most of the time, if this is going between 1 and 2, then we're looking at 80 to 160 connections to Cloud SQL. But as I'm starting to think about how to configure my Cloud SQL instance, I'm going to really focus on when it spikes to 3, because I don't want it to spike to 3 and then that cause some errors because Cloud SQL can't handle it, and then it kind of starts to snowball into some other things. So let's imagine 3. That's 80 times 3. We have 240 connections. Okay, we know we can look at our chart and we can see that if a Cloud SQL instance is configured with 6 gigabytes of memory, then we can have 200 connections. Great, we're gonna go with that, and we're gonna set the flag to update the 200 to 250. So now we have something to monitor, to look at the charts, to look at the logs, and to see how it's performing. If we start to add some additional applications, some other vendors are sending data in, well, we can monitor the Cloud Run service and we can see if that number of containers starts to go to 3 and stay at 3, and then we can think about tweaking these settings. There are a lot of things that these types of managed serverless products get us. The auto scaling is really great because we're paying for the resources that we are using. And when we are not using the Edfi API, well, then we are not paying for Cloud Run. But that doesn't mean that we can just let them auto scale to infinity. We do need to give them some rules to kind of stay within. So those are some things that I think you should consider when you are configuring your Cloud Run services and your Cloud SQL instance. It's important that you really think about how to right size them for your number of students and for your number of integrations.